Part of the remit of the Citizenship Trust is to provide for the education of the people of Glasgow on matters of citizenship, whether that be local, national, or international. So we take these public lectures as one of the ways we seek to fulfill Sir Daniel's vision. And I would be remiss if I did not note that tonight's talk is co-sponsored by the Scottish Council on Global Affairs, with the prominent sign just behind me here, which is the first all-Scotland international relations institute, providing a hub for collaborative policy relevant research and a home for informed, nonpartisan debate on all areas of foreign and security policy. We could not have a more timely lecture than that offered this evening by Professors Abrahamsen and Williams. Many in this room will be aware that yesterday the Scottish government called for or held a summit of political and civil society leaders to discuss what concrete steps can be taken to ensure that the far-right political movements do not undermine democratic values in Scotland. My suspicion is that tonight's lecture will help us contextualize some of those sorts of discussions which are being held in countries around the world. In their book, World of the Right, Radical Conservatism and Global Order, Professors Abrahamsen and Williams, along with several co-authors, many co-authors, take a wider perspective in analyzing radical conservative political movements than do many far-right studies out there. Rather than asking what motivates far-right in country X or country Y, the team of scholars take a step back to assess the international dimension, applying theories and approaches familiar to scholars who study international relations. Just to note, amongst its many plaudits, the book World of the Right has been listed by the New Statesman as one of the best academic books published in 2024. So we are particularly pleased to welcome tonight's speakers, who are Rita Abrahamsen, who is a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, and the 2025-2026 Nelson Mandela Professor at Rhodes University in South Africa. She is currently a Leverhulme Visiting Professor at the University of Birmingham. Michael Williams is a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, which seems to be a bit of a theme amongst the co-authors of their book, and a global professor, professorial fellow at Queen Mary University of London. He is currently a Leverhulme Visiting Professor at Queen Mary University, London. So we're fortunate to be able to have them visit us here at the university and share with us their book and their insights from it. Just before I turn over the microphone, I'll note that we are recording the lecture tonight, which we will make available on our website as soon as we can, which you can find by Googling Stevenson Trust Glasgow. So with that, can we please welcome Professors Abrahamsen and Williams, and they actually do an old school sort of lecture and won't be using slides. So that's a relief to many of you. Right. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. This is a topic that is becoming increasingly impossible to talk about, because you cannot open a newspaper on any given morning, or a website, or any other form of media that you might happen to look at these days without being confronted by something going on in the radical right. It is almost literally overwhelming on a day-to-day basis. What we try to do in this book, and what we'll try to lay out tonight, is an argument that seeks to understand these political movements as more than simply episodic, as more than simply nationally based, as something that is in fact intrinsically global, that in fact relies on the global for part of how it functions. It relies on the global both in terms of its international networks, which we'll talk about a little bit later tonight, but also it relies on a particular vision of the global for its ideological content. That is, for the thing which it mobilizes against. So we first started looking at these questions around 2015. I think there's some students in the class in the room tonight, but hopefully, yeah, no, it's all right. So I got to remind you guys of what the world looked like back in 2015. This was before Donald Trump had come down the golden escalators in Trump Towers, right? This was before Trump won. This was way before Trump 2. This was a world when globalization seemed not only rampant, but unstoppable. It was what we used to back in the old days called TINA. There is no alternative. It was when Davos seemed to be the place where everything important politically was happening. And when we first started doing this work, in fact, the most common responses to it were, well, this is all really fascinating, but let's get real. Surely this is all just epiphenomenal. This is about to go away. There's nothing serious happening here. And our intuition, and I think we were just plain lucky rather than necessarily smart, and the world may have been unlucky, was that there was more going on than simply an effervescence politically. So there was something quite profound going on. And what we'll try to sketch out tonight is what we think that more profound layer is. To do this, we need to get beyond, we think, 3 standard prejudices, if you like, or perspectives on this, that all of which capture some of it, but which too often tend to reduce our understanding of this phenomenon. The first of these is that this is all really just about technology, that it is the emergence of the internet, it is the emergence of digital media that gives us most of what we need to understand about the radical right. Now, there is clearly something to this, indisputable, that the radical right has often, in fact, been masterful at its use of digital technologies. But our argument is that a shift in the medium, that is a move to something like a digital world from a print world, is not enough if you don't have a message to transmit through that medium. And we think that there are underlying, indeed unifying messages that give these movements power beyond their ability to mobilize digitally. The second prejudice that we think we have to overcome is that this is just economics. This is particularly captured in the very, very popular narrative that it's all just the left behinds, right? This is the people in the deindustrialized parts of the world who all of a sudden are taking their revenge upon liberalism and globalization. Again, clearly there is something to this. But if we look particularly at electoral politics almost all over the world, the left behind simply are not demographically numerous enough to bring about these kinds of shifts. There have to be wider alliances, wider allegiances between different groups to provide the kind of political heft to give us the transformations that we're seeing. The third prejudice we think we have to move behind, and it's one that academics, I hate to say, are particularly susceptible to, is that the radical right is, to use a technical political science word, stupid. Okay? That is, these people don't have any ideas. They're incapable of thinking. This is what we sometimes call the knuckle dragger theory of the right, yeah? That somehow the people in logging boots and leather jackets have made it up out of the alleys and somehow are running the world. The problem with the knuckle dragger theory is A, again, there isn't enough knuckle dragging to change electoral politics. But B, if we actually look at these movements, they are often highly intellectual. They are often extremely sophisticated in their political understandings, their political ideologies, and their political strategies. And while we don't want to argue that one should only look at these things, we do argue that if we don't look at those ideological dimensions, we miss a very, very important part of what is going on. And that's what we seek to do in this book and what we'll try to sketch out now. Our argument is that the emergence of the radical right is not something that we can trace to 2016. It is not something that we can even trace a little bit earlier than that. It is something that has been at least a half century in the building, probably longer. That its roots lie, in fact, in the late 1960s, particularly in France, in the French Nouvelle Droite, where you found the emergence of a series of ideas, ideologues, quite literally, seeking to rethink a political foundation for radical right-wing politics. These are people, some of whom are actually still alive. The most interesting one here, the grand old man of the French right, Alain de Benoit, is still alive, still active, still writing. And the argument that came out of this movement in the late 1960s was that the right needed to give up radical anti-democratic politics. It needed to give up the idea of storming and overthrowing the Bastille. What it needed to do was turn to what they called metapolitics. And metapolitics is the idea, simply put, that all great political transformations are the product or the outcome of prior transformations in ideas and in culture. That is, to quote the famous American right-wing organizer Andrew Breitbart, that politics is downstream from culture. And once you have won the cultural and the intellectual battles or laid the foundations, then you can begin to move in political movements with success. And what we try to trace in this book is the way in which the radical right has done precisely that, and the way in which that ideological formation both involves the global and is global. We try to trace this through their use of a very, very unpredictable figure, if you like, a very strange figure for them to draw upon. And that is the radical leftist Marxist thinker, Antonio Gramsci. If you read the radical right, one of the most striking things is how much they love Gramsci. Gramsci, Italian Marxist thinkers in the late teens through the 1920s, opponents of Mussolini, famous for writing the prison notebooks, imprisoned for a decade before his death. And what was Gramsci's main idea? What was it they're so intrigued by? Why did they want to construct what the French thinker Dominique Venner once called a Gramscianism of the right? The argument goes something like this, that if you really want a successful political movement, you've got to understand the hegemonic formation that underlies your opponents. You've got to understand the ideological, the economic, and the political aspects that fit together to form what Gramsci called a historic bloc. And if you want to confront that hegemony, what the radical right views as a liberal hegemony, you have got to create a counter-hegemonic movement. That is, you have to understand that form of power of your opponents better than it understands itself. And you have to develop a series of tools, networks, and mobilizations that will allow you to attack it, undermine it, and eventually overthrow it. This form of right-wing Gramscianism, we argue, is common to almost all right-wing movements around the world, radical right-wing movements around the world. Whether they articulate it in Gramscian terms or not, which they frequently, shockingly frequently do, most or all of them believe in a counter-hegemonic ideological struggle is fundamental to winning the political fight that they are engaged in. One of the core dimensions of any counter-hegemonic struggle is not simply to explain how your adversaries operate. It is to identify who those adversaries are. And in the most striking form of counter-hegemonic politics, the best thing that you can do is identify quite literally who your enemies are. That is, if you can identify an enemy, you can mobilize people commonly against that enemy. We try to unpack this element of their strategy by looking at what the political thinker Ernesto Laclau once characterized as equivalences. That is, to build a counter-hegemonic movement, you don't need to have people who all think the same. You don't even need to have people who are all based in the same country or in the same area. What you need to do is build a series of what Leclau calls equivalences. That is, an ideology which allows people to see their position, what they regard as their oppression, as part of a wider struggle against the same enemy. If you can do this, Leclau argues, you can put together counter-hegemonic movements that don't depend upon a classical leadership model. You don't need a unified party. You don't, in fact, need any centralized control room. If we're looking for a centralized control room behind the contemporary radical global right, we are not going to find one. Steve Bannon has consistently tried to portray himself as such a person, and he has consistently failed. They succeed not because they are that kind of a movement, but because they have succeeded in creating equivalences through which different groups see themselves as part of the same struggle, even if those groups are quite disparate economically, culturally, or geographically. Who then are these enemies? Well, the enemies is what in contemporary radical right parlance, we hear every day these days, are the liberal elite. But what are the liberal elite? Here we argue they draw upon a specific understanding of the evolution of societies throughout the 20th century. In other words, this isn't simply picking on elites that is an easy thing to do. When the radical right talks about a global liberal elite, they are mobilizing a specific understanding of history, politics, economics, and society. And that particular understanding emerges out of a vision of the world that we trace to what's called managerialism. And you can trace this back in many different ways. But the most interesting place that we think to find it is in James Burnham's 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution. Burnham is a fascinating guy. I don't know if many of you have run across Burnham. He was obscure for 30 or 40 years. He's now everywhere, especially if you read the radical right. Burnham was Trotsky's main lieutenant in the United States in the late 1930s, before he broke with Trotsky and became a member of American conservatism, along with William Buckley. William F. Buckley founded the National Review and a variety of other really important movements. And Burnham's argument went something like this, that if you want to understand the 20th century, you have to understand that it is a century of managerial power. It is the century when capitalism is no longer run primarily by the people who own it, but by the experts who run it. That is, by people who generate their positions and their power on the basis of their expertise. If you want to understand cultural institutions, you need to understand the way that they too are run primarily by people who characterize their authority as coming from their expertise. If you want to understand education, take a look at the modern university. You need to look at people who generate their power through claims of expertise. From the perspective of managerial sociology, then, the 20th century is a period in which what Burnham and his followers came to call a new class of experts became the elite of society. This new class of experts is mutually reinforcing. They go to the same schools, or they all go to schools, they all go to universities. They cross over between different kinds of power positions, from the corporate world to the political world to the cultural world. They move across borders. Indeed, not only do they move across borders, they seek to expand expert rule around the world. After all, what could be wrong with expertise? What could be the problem with knowledge? Knowledge is universal, is it not? Knowledge, therefore, must be a universal good, mustn't it? Therefore, shouldn't legal experts rule all over the world and indeed get together to figure out how to rule the world? Shouldn't economic experts rule and get together and figure out how to run the world economically? Shouldn't cultural elites spread their cultural wisdom around the world? In this form, managerial theory argues, a new elite came to dominate not only inside states, but across states. This managerial elite accrues authority through ever-increasing valuation of its own expertise. What it does in the process is destroys everything that does not fit with its vision of the world. It destroys traditions. It destroys localities. It flattens the globe out. Universal human rights, universal economic neoliberalism, universal legal structures are all, from this perspective, a consequence of managerial rule and carried out by managerial elites. What this vision, ideological vision of the world allows then, is not simply to explain to people in different places why they are being screwed over, quite literally, in the ways that they feel they are being screwed over. It is to point out to them precisely who is doing so and how it is you can therefore begin to change it. It is not an abstract logic of capitalism that can't be resisted. There is an alternative. There is an alternative because there are agents. We know who they are. We know what they're doing. We know how they're doing it. And therefore, we can, with sufficient insight and mobilization, know how to undermine them and overthrow them. And this, we argue, is something that the radical right has achieved. That is, its counter-hegemonic project has achieved a degree, sometimes a remarkable degree, of ideological success. We would argue, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later, that if you look at the contemporary Trump administration, many of its actions that seem disparate, that seem anarchic, in fact, are unified by a logic of attacking managerial elites. What the radical right is equally conscious of, however, is that ideas alone do not change the world. You have to have ideas. You have to have culture. But to get those ideas into the world, to give them power, to give them energy, to give them agency, you also need institutions. You need to build those institutions as part of your counter-hegemonic struggle. This too is something that they have been undertaking for decades. And it's this that I want to now flip over to Rita to talk about from that perspective.
Hi. Thank you for applauding to Michael. Thank you for coming. It's lovely to see so many here. As I'm going to pick up where Michael left off. So this idea that the radical right has taken on Gramsci and made Gramsci their own theorist is quite fascinating. And they have, in a way, launched this patient, long-term struggle to change the way we think. Because if liberalism and the liberal elite is the enemy, then we need another elite that thinks differently, that behaves differently. And Michael mentioned at the beginning of his talk how we all know how good the radical right has been in terms of using social media to challenge the way we think and to transgress normal forms of behavior. But what we want to show very much in the book is that there's more to this counter-hegemonic struggle. They've also fought this counter-hegemonic struggle very decisively on a more traditional battleground, a more traditional intellectual battleground, the universities, academic publishing, and think tanks. And we think that this has been a very important part of their struggle. It isn't necessarily new, but there's been an escalation in this way of trying to change common sense. And there has been a decisive move to do so. So let me say a little bit about these 3 different strategies that they have pursued. Publishing, very noticeable in the last decade, 2 decades now, how we've seen a surge in academic texts that are explicitly radical right and that are proud of being radical right. So there are a few publishing houses that are worth advertising or highlighting. They did not publish our book, but maybe they will become as powerful and as far-reaching as established academic presses. Arctos, I don't know if any of you have come across Arctos. Arctos was set up in 2010 by somebody who used to be one of these knuckle draggers that Michael talked about. He's a sweet old Daniel Friedberg. He used to be a neo-Nazi. And all of a sudden, one day he said, I'm giving up on that. I'm dedicating my life to the metapolitical struggle. And he set up Arctos. And since they were set up in 2010, Arctos has published 170 titles in more than 16 languages. You can buy their books now on Amazon. And one of the first things he did was to reach back to the Nouvelle Droite, the first text from the 1960s. Those texts by Dominique Venna, Alain de Benoit, and so forth were really only available in French. And if they were available in sort of respectable libraries, they normally were locked away in the basements where nobody went to borrow them. The first thing he did with Arctos was to translate them all into English, then into into German, then into Swedish. And you can now read all these texts and find them easily in bookshops, on Amazon, and so forth. His slogan for the press is making anti-globalization global. And we've done so since 2010. So there's a very deliberate kind of counter-hegemonic struggle here. One of the sort of competitors to Arctos is an American press called Countercurrents. Countercurrents also is very much associated with one person. His name is Greg Johnson. He's a white nationalist. He self-identifies as a white nationalist. Countercurrents has followed a very similar strategy to Arctos, but it also has a more cultural stream in its publishing. So it is highlighting film theory, literary text. It has a very kind of strong stream of film interpretation where you can read about how Batman and James Bond are really radical right heroes. It focuses on Eliot and Wagner and so forth to say, you went to school and the teachers told you that all artists were really on the left, but they lied to you. The big artists in the world are really and have always been on the right. For those of you who have children, perhaps, I think this is now pretty old, but My Little Pony, they have a version of My Little Pony. It's called My Nationalist Pony. And in the kingdom of Equestria, they find deep right-wing truths among the unicorns and the ponies and the dragons. There are many other publishing houses. We could ask, what does it mean? Does it mean anything at all? Anyone here who's written a book know that just because you've written it doesn't mean that anyone read it. Sorry to tell you that, but that is the case, right? But what it signals to us is that the radical right takes the battle of ideas very, very seriously. It signals to us that they're very much trying to design for themselves academic credibility. They are trying to say, yes, there was perhaps a little bit of a fascist past. And they have kind of reissued the old classics of the right, like Julius Evola and Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West. Those books have also been reissued and translated into many languages. But they are reducing that part of the radical right history, the fascist history, to kind of a little bit of a bracket. And then they're saying, now we are a respectable form of political theory. We have our own intellectual tradition. We have all of this, and you can buy it alongside all other kinds of books. So when you go on the website on many of these people, it's quite interesting to see there's a kind of new iconography where they like to have their portraits taken next to a bookshelf. So many of you who are academics probably have your portraits next to a bookshelf. Well, a lot of the radical right figures also have their portraits next to a bookshelf to say, here we are, serious academics, serious intellectuals. The other thing we can see very clearly is the way in which they have engaged with universities. These days, this is very much in the news, of course, with the Trump administration's attack on American universities, and particularly the elite universities. But just because they're attacking the universities, it doesn't mean they're anti-elitist. What they're trying to do and what they are engaged in doing is shaping the right kind of elite. And if we look around the world where the radical right is strong, we see that they are trying to set up and have set up their own universities. So the best example of this is really Hungary. Michael and I came back from Hungary not very long ago, from Budapest. Viktor Orban has set up 2 universities, the Ludovika Public School of Service, where he's trying to educate, or his professors are trying to educate people who can be bureaucrats in the service of national interest, and who can go also deliberately to the European Union and staff all the offices there and serve a nationalist policy. The institute or the university that is even more interesting in Hungary is the MCC, the Matthias Corvinus Collegium. Funded, most British universities can only dream of this, in 1920 to the tune of £1.6 billion. It has campuses in something like 12 different cities in Hungary now, over 7,000 students. And it's again dedicated to educating an elite that is committed to right-wing ideology, to nationalist ideology. And the MCC has a lot of partnerships all over the world, particularly through something called the Roger Scruton Foundation. It means you can go to Cambridge. If you study there, you can go on exchange to Cambridge, to Oxford. I don't know if there's one in Glasgow, there might be. If we go to Paris, or rather to Lyon in France, Marion Maréchal, who's the niece of Marine Le Pen, several years ago, she set up a university that is deliberately dedicated to challenging the whole of the left on higher education in France. So it's a challenge to Sciences Po, a challenge to Sorbonne. And if you go to Marion Maréchal's school in Lyon, you will be taught about national values, about the importance of being rooted in a culture. And you can also go on exchanges to multiple other universities around the world. The school has set up a sister institution in Madrid, which is very closely aligned with the Vox party, which is the radical right party in Spain. So we are seeing a kind of evolving ecosystem of universities that are not teaching what I guess you would be teaching in political studies and sociology and so forth, or history in Glasgow University. You're teaching the right kind of values, the right kind of theory, the right kind of acting in the world once you leave. Many of those students who leave can now go and work for a whole host of think tanks that have been set up. Again, trying to both shape common sense or change common sense, and to provide policy advice that are informed by radical right ideas. So one reason, for example, that the Trump administration has managed to be so effective since they came to power is that when they lost in 2020, there was a rush to set up new think tanks. And there was a rush of people who worked in those think tanks that were already established. So the Heritage Foundation furnished the new Trump administration with policy. The America First Policy Institute in Washington was for a long time described as a White House in waiting. But also in Europe, in many places, we have seen a flourishing of think tanks that are dedicated to this kind of thinking, this kind of policy. I mentioned the MCC in Hungary, which is a university, but it is also a think tank. And it has a think tank in Brussels, explicitly dedicated to change thinking within the EU and around the EU. As an aside, it's quite interesting that the director or the research director of the MCC in Brussels is a former professor, Frank Furedi. I used to teach his book on the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. He was also at one point in time the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party in Britain. He now works for Viktor Orban as a director of the MCC in Brussels. Taken a long journey, an interesting journey. The MCC is also about and planning to set up a branch in London and in Vienna, and I think possibly in Paris. So what we're seeing is an emerging ecosystem of think tanks, of universities, of publishers that are all dedicated to changing common sense, that are all dedicated to producing what Gramsci called the long march through the institutions. And one of the things we want to do in the book, I don't think we've showed you the book, it's very nice, it's red. I like that. One of the things we try to argue in the book and to ask, the big question is really, what if they succeed? Because we are all scholars of international politics. What if they succeed? What will the world look like? What is the world that they wish for? What is their vision of the world? They do not have a single vision. There isn't a uniform, global, radical right sort of utopia of world politics. Some of them, to be honest, don't have any idea at all about what the world should look like. But if we look carefully and keep in mind all the differences, all the variations, there are still key ideas, still key outlooks that we can say everyone pretty much on the radical right would agree on this in one way or another. Those three topics are that the radical right is in one way or another sovereigntist. They are in one way or another dedicated to a more civilizational organization of world politics. And they are all also in one way or another believers in multipolarity. So let me say a little bit about those three things and how it kind of works and how it allows what Michael talked about, these equivalences, these transversal alliances that makes the radical right global and transnational. So to say that they are sovereigntists, that's probably the sort of easiest one to summarize quickly. It means that they are anti-globalist. Most radical right thinkers, politicians, activists are anti-globalists, but they are not necessarily anti-internationalists. So they are not seeking to kind of smash and abandon all the international architecture that we have. They would rather kind of change the institutions from within. So if we look at the EU or the United Nations, we already see this pretty much at work. We see that within the EU, we are getting a move by virtue of the radical right parties that are there towards more sovereigntist policies. The idea that the EU should stop interfering in so many different things, and this should really legitimately be within the jurisdiction of individual nations. We see the same thing being pushed within the United Nations. In the book, we trace it, for example, through family policies. The idea that the United Nations and the new elite, the new class, have started to interfere too much in family policies in various countries, and that this is not something that really should be the domain of the UN. It should be properly the domain of sovereign national jurisdictions. So the sovereigntist is kind of anti-globalist, but still internationalist, taking control back home, changing international institutions from within. The second dimension is a little bit more difficult to summarize because there's so many different versions of it. But in one way or another, they are all civilizational. They believe in civilizations. This is not multiculturalism, something very different. There's a sense among radical right thinkers that the world has been ruined, as Michael said, by global liberalism. The global managerial elite has flattened cultures, destroyed them, made us all the same. Wherever you go, you can drink Coca-Cola and Starbucks, and there's really nothing that is different anymore. And against this sort of boring vision of sameness, what the radical right says is the true beauty of the world is our difference. The true beauty of the world is different cultures. And they believe and they argue, and we can question it, but they argue and believe that all cultures are different. They are incommensurably different. But none are superior. None has a right to dominate others. Therefore, they portray themselves as being very, very critical of US domination, very critical of Western domination, very anti-imperialist. They meet a lot of the radical left here. They claim to be differentialists, but not racist. They believe, they say, that the world should be made up of different civilizations. So we could have a Western civilization, an Asian civilization, a Russian civilization, and they might dominate their own areas, but none of them have a right to dominate all of the world. And what this idea of civilizations facilitate is alliances with other people in other parts of the world that also feel that they are dominated or stigmatized by Western liberalism. Those people who are tired of people coming and saying, hey, guys, you need to be more democratic. You need to allow LGBT rights. Because that's what you do when you're a proper Western liberal nation. So what the claim to civilizationalism facilitates is transversal alliances between peoples in the global south, in the global north, and elsewhere, who all feel stigmatized or oppressed by liberalism and by global elites. One of my favorite examples of this, and we trace it a little bit in the book, is a West African activist called Kemi Seba. Kemi Seba calls himself a supra-Pan-Africanist. That means he's like a super mega amazing Pan-Africanist who is hyper radical on the left. But Kemi Seba is a very close ally of Alexander Dugin, who is one of the chief advisors and one of the chief intellectual stimulations behind Putin's foreign policy. He's also closely aligned with Alain de Benoit, who is one of the chief ideologues behind the French radical right. So you see these transversal alliances that emerges around civilizationalism. The final thing that they have in common when they think about the future of the world is that they believe in multipolarity. Multipolarity, again, is not the multipolarity of international relations 101, where we kind of have different states of roughly equal power that have a balance of power, a strategic balance, something very different. Multipolarity for the radical right is again civilizations, a world made up of different poles of civilizations. Western civilization, European, Asian, and so forth. And these civilizations must somehow, oftentimes, cooperate on crucial questions like perhaps climate, perhaps nuclear, the threat of nuclear disaster. But the civilizations, the poles, the different poles here, are not moving in the same direction. We can be on very different trajectories, depending on the different cultures and civilizations. So the world is not moving on one track here. There are multiple poles with different cultural spheres. And again, what this view of multipolarity allows is, again, different alliances, different transversal alliances and equivalences. You can see very clearly, for example, how this echoes, even if it's different, from Russia's belief in multipolarity. Russia's foreign policy is very explicitly one of multipolarity. India has long had a view of itself not only as a civilization, an Asian civilization, but as part of a multipolar world. And coming together, these different views of multipolarity form a very strong challenge to what we have come to know of as the liberal world order. It forms a very strong challenge to what we have come to know as the institutions of the liberal world order, even if they are very different. And we can see this play itself out in very different ways. But today, as, for example, President Zelensky of Ukraine has been in South Africa. Why is he there? One reason is that South Africa chose a very particular path in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It did not vote, and it was criticized very strongly for this. It did not vote with the West against the invasion. It voted with Russia or it abstained. For South Africa, as a country in the South, a leader of countries in the global South, it felt that it had for long been dominated and stigmatized by Western imperialism. It combined its own view of non-alignment, its desire for a more multipolar world, which means more freedom. And it resulted in siding with votes in the United Nations that is widely seen as contributing towards eroding one of the key features of the liberal world order, namely respect for territorial sovereignty. So we see a whole set of different possibilities that come out of this. We are not suggesting in the book that the radical right is succeeding. We are not suggesting that this vision of the world is going to come to fruition, but we do think that we are seeing signs of it succeeding in various ways. And what we argue very strongly, and this will be the final thought that I leave you with, is that much as we can see in all of these visions that I have described and what we have talked about this evening, differences, fragmentation, disputes, and arguments within the radical right. It is tempting for us to say, but it's not like that here, it's not like that in France, or it's not like that in Germany, and they're ultimately going to fall out because X, Y, and Z. What we are suggesting in the book is that the strength of the right comes in large part from its ability to form these alliances, these transversal alliances and equivalences, and that therefore it is stronger than the sum of its parts. And to a certain extent, as scholars, we are trapped in a way of thinking that looks for differences and for nationalist agendas behind the radical right. And if we come at it in this way, it is much easier and we think very important to capture this ability of the contemporary radical right to be global, to live with differences, and to agree with, yeah, we're not going to be always seeing the same, but they come together in ways that perform a function without having a central control room that is a serious challenge to what we have come to know as the liberal world order. So I will leave you with that and look forward to the questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Don't forget the book.
No.
Thank you both so much. It was a master class in giving a lecture, as well as the topics. Whilst I give the audience a moment to sort of think of questions that we'll come to, I'm going to abuse my privilege. So in the title of the book, you talk about radical conservatism, and throughout your remarks, you can guess where I'm going with this. You talk about radical right. I noticed you don't really use the term far right in the way you were discussing it. Could you, so you started to get there towards the end, but maybe give us a bit of a definition of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about radical conservatism, radical right, why you choose not to use the term far right? I'm guessing this is a question that you've heard before.
Yes.
You want to go? You want me to? Okay, I'll go. I'll see if I can have a go at this one. This is a question that is a constant. And there's a couple of ways we can come at it. I mean, the first one is to say that this question is not simply one of those of us who study the radical right or the right in general. It is a actual practical question of the right these very days, right? Defining what it means to be a conservative is part of the practical politics and fights of contemporary conservatism. And you see it every day being articulated amongst conservatives and between conservative parties. So it's not simply an analytic question, it's a very practical power political question that I think is up for grabs in a way that hasn't been in quite some time. We'll talk about why in just a second. We would differentiate the radical right from the far right in that the radical right tends to not discredit the processes of democracy. Right? It tends not to be anti-democratic in the sense of something requiring violent overthrow. That we think distinguishes it from many forms of radical right politics. That line is tricky, but we think it's there and that it's important. What distinguishes it, what makes it radical, we think, that distinguishes it from other forms of conservatism, is that traditionally conservatism, indeed traditional conservatism, has been about the idea of conserving, right? It's been about the idea that what do conservatives want to do? They want to keep what one has inherited in the world. The radical right believes in no small part because of its understanding of the 20th century as the triumph of managerial liberalism, that there is almost nothing left worth conserving, right? We do not want to conserve the world of managerial liberalism. We want to overthrow that world. We don't want to conserve the world of Reaganite or Bushite conservatism. We want to overthrow them. Their time is gone. And that, we think, gives it a radical, a self-consciously radical dimension. My favorite example of this, if anybody is interested, it's no longer available on the website, which is really interesting, but you can still find it out on the web, is to take a look at a blog piece written for the website First Things, which is a largely Catholic oriented conservative website, called Against the Dead Consensus. And the argument is, and it's by a bunch of people who are very powerful in the contemporary American, what we would call radical right, quite close to the Trump administration, many of them now, that American conservatism from the 1950s to about 2010 is dead. It is dead as a political project. It is dead as an intellectual and ideological mobilizer. It is dead as a vote winner. And therefore, their position is that the dead consensus needs to be buried and overthrown by something radical and new, but conservative. Thus, a radical conservatism. Hope that makes some kind of sense.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a couple of disconnected questions. I probably wasn't the only person in the audience towards the end of Rita's remarks to be somewhat surprised when you said that the sovereigntists are not territorial sovereignty. Doesn't this kind of raise an issue? Because the same particular issue you raised, which you left your remark. The problem if you've got civilization is that there's a Russian civilization view of the history of Ukraine, and there's a Ukrainian view of the history of Ukraine, and there's Charlene. So if you're taking a civilization perspective, how do you decide where to stand on Ukraine? And that's the narrow question. The broader question I want to raise is, I mean, your intellectual history is absolutely fascinating. I've learned a lot with you. But at some point, don't we, you expect me to say this as a kind of connection to this. At some point, we have to say, well, why is it that this view of the world has potential purchase for people who don't follow the output of think tanks or read quasi-academic books, i.e. the general public? And I would suggest to you here that there's a bit of an irony, which is that arguably one of the key reasons why this has happened is because managerialism is no longer an elite. It's actually at least a half of the population, because of the way in which we have developed the so-called knowledge economy. A half of these are managerialists. But it does mean that, therefore, educational credentials have become so much more important. in terms of economic advancement. And if you are not part of what is no longer a university elite, but simply a university mainstream, then you may well feel that you're on the outside. So my irony here is that actually it's no longer a liberal elite, it's a liberal majority. And it's a lot of the success of the radical right is in response to the fact that they are a minority against what is now a liberal majority.
You want us to go? Yeah. Spot on your question about, well, both, and civilizationalism. This is a view of the world that is filled with contradictions and tensions, right? And it's, I mean, your example of Russian civilizationalism is the best one. If you are a Russian civilizationalist, you have a view that means that there is no Ukraine, right? So within this, there are mega tensions, and there are people within Europe, for example, who believe that there is no such thing as the right-wing people within Europe who think that, like Alain de Benoit, that there is no European civilization. We should go way further back and have a kind of minimal ethno-state, right? Whereas others within the European radical right are firm believers in a European civilization, like a massive European civilization, or possibly even a Western civilization. So in the book, we do try to disentangle some of this and point to the different tensions. Again, if you go to Asia and talk about an Indian or Asian civilization, there are many within Asia that would be very skeptical of that, right? Because it would crush other civilizations. So within civilization, there could be its own form of imperialism, right? So the tensions that this leads to with a multipolar world are undeniable. This is not necessarily going to be a peaceful world. It could be quite the opposite, right? And when Marco Rubio said a few days after the new Trump administration and he was taking over, he said something along the lines that, you know, this world that we've had, where the unipolar world when US and the West have dominated, that's really not quite usual. It's not common, it's not normal, he said, indicating both his own view that, you know, we might be moving towards a more multipolar world, in part made up of civilization, but there is not an assumption here, and certainly not from our side, that this is a better world or a more peaceful world, right? But I think there is a really interesting tension in a lot of the writing on this from the radical right between the civilizations and the ethno-nationalists, right? So how deep down do you drill, or how high up do you draw that civilizational similarity?
Yeah, just very quickly to build on that a little bit. One of the other things that's interesting, I think, here is that you do see also the resurgence of an older idea form of thinking about international politics, which is a very old form of geopolitics, hooked around the idea of civilizational states. So you might say, if you are a member of the Trump administration, I think there are people in the Trump administration who do believe in this kind of way of looking at the world. There are civilizational great powers, and that those are going to provide order within literally their geopolitical spaces. And other states, even if they are small civilizational states, are simply out of luck. And I suspect there are quite a number of people in the Trump administration who believe that Ukraine is such a small civilizational state. There are also, really interestingly, very big questions, for example, about whether the West is such a thing at all, right? When J.D. Vance gave his infamous speech in Munich, this was precisely what he was articulating, that maybe the United States is not part of a West at all. Maybe the United States is a specific kind of West, a civilizational state on its own, quite distinct from Europe, and actually not particularly interested in what happens in Europe so long as Europe doesn't become geopolitically problematic. So if that's the case, then you begin to see a world of great space politics, each centered around a civilizational great power state. And that, I think, is a world order that is at least one of the visions of the world that is floating around right now on the radical right. You also see it, by the way, in certain parts of Central and Eastern Europe about what to do vis-a-vis Russia. Very interesting ideas, really old ideas that are bubbling up to the surface again around the intermarium and all kinds of weird ideas about the European state. On just very quickly on the structure of electoral policies, I completely agree. And here one does actually have to differentiate out, right, in a way that you know much better than almost anybody else. One has to differentiate out between different countries and the way in which different constituencies can be mobilized. But one of the things that this movement against liberalism allows, liberal managerialism, is also the mobilization of cultural resentments, right? It's the mobilization not simply against managers, but the mobilization against people who tell you how to run your life, right? People who tell you how to raise your kids, people who tell you what you can and cannot say, people who tell you what you can and cannot watch. So on the one hand, you have the potential for economic mobilization, the left behind, if you like, or just general economic disgruntlement. But on the other hand, you have a very powerful potential for cultural mobilization. And those two things, I don't necessarily have to fuse in the same groups, but you can mobilize the equivalence across both. So if, for example, you look at the situation that I know best, the American one, you find people who have done extremely well out of the last 40 years, you know, who are not members of the 1%, but they're certainly members of the 10%, but who also cannot stand managerial liberalism, not because they've been economically disadvantaged, but because they feel culturally resentful about it. That then becomes, I think, a very powerful, weird fusion that plays itself out in different places in different ways, but within the same logics.
It's sort of a fascinating talk, and the contract I had was, you actually tried to address it right there, sort of about culture wars. When I read and watch material from these radical right figures, I hear a lot more about, you know, race and gender issues than you sort of spoken about here tonight. So I'm just wondering what role race and gender narratives and stories play in the story you're talking about, the radical right. Is there a fear you're underplaying the power of the purchase, that discourses of gender hierarchies and reactionary attitudes towards race play in radical right? So I'm just wondering what your response to that.
Want to go with that one?
Okay. It plays, both race and gender plays strongly, and it plays in very many different ways. One of the ways, just to speak about what we do in the book, one of the ways we trace the gender angle in the book is through family policies and LGBTQ+ policies and the mobilization of that. And we trace it through the coming together of a whole lot of different actors, some who are on the right and some who are not on the right, but who share the opposition to what they perceive, and this goes to the culture war, what they perceive as an imposition of a particular way of living your life, what you must like, what you must not like. And we trace it through the opposition to this through the UN, and then traveling down to a very local case study, for example, in Uganda in Africa. And through there, we very clearly see a gender argument. What is interesting in that example is that gender is a mobilizer, but race does not really figure, right? So there are so many different ways in which we could read both of them. I think another part, so the book is very much focused on the thinking, the theory, the ideologies. There's a lot of practical politics and policy in it, but it's more on the idea. And I think one of the things we wanted to do with that is to also say that there is more to the radical right than only race and gender.
I think that's a good answer. Thank you. But it's just to give you the cop-out answer, it's an incredibly complicated question. You're absolutely right. It plays, but it plays differently. And you know, one of the things, for example, to come back to electoral politics, one of the great mistakes that many, you know, for me, the Democratic Party in the United States is the classic illustration of this, right? Is to assume that these things will break down on racial or ethnic lines, right? So the classic mistake of the Democratic Party to assume that the Hispanic vote was overwhelmingly theirs, right? Or to assume that the entirety of the Black vote was overwhelmingly theirs without looking at the way that got divided around gender differentials, right? Whereas Black women voters tended to be very, very much still strongly Democratic. The Black male vote eroded quite considerably towards Trump. And in some places, crucially, in terms of that erosion. So there's a really interesting thing, I think, here for political, at the most basic party political actor levels, to think about their assumptions about what mobilizes people and how. A really, really good question, I think.
I was just wondering how religion fits in the picture, because often when I think about this, I think about not only a shift of how people, politicians in particular, present themselves in connection to religion, but also how religion sometimes seems to be used as a tool. I don't know if that just fits within the culture aspect of what we think about. And then I don't know, maybe just touch on the point, it's like irony of, you know, the rallying against, you know, being told what to do, but then obviously in a lot of religions, there is also a lot of rules, and you also about sort of like abortion issues and you know, things like that. So just curious to see how religion fits into this.
It's another a really good question, and I feel I could give almost the same answer. It's really important and it plays in different ways, which is not a cop-out, or maybe it is, but you know, religion, you see it now, for example, I don't know if you've read in the paper, all the radical right in the US, Steve Bannon and others, who really want to have a say in who's going to be the next pope, right? Because they are unhappy. Many of them are, interestingly, fascinatingly, recent convert in the US, but not only in the US, recent converts to Catholicism. But they have been very dissatisfied with the recently departed Pope and his liberal, inclusive agenda, right? And they feel that this is a betrayal of Catholicism, of Christianity. So that is one strand that plays quite strongly and interestingly in some parts of it, right? And in the family example that I mentioned, that oftentimes people want to say, oh, those are all the evangelicals, right? It's all the evangelicals who are opposed to same-sex marriage that have, for example, driven the agenda against this in other parts of the world, in the global south. Part of what we want to argue is that that is an important part of this coalition. But again, it's not only driven by religious actors. Another example, maybe you can talk about the example of Europe and the, oh, so one interesting example is how religion has been mobilized in part of Scandinavia and the Netherlands, where it's explicitly against Muslims, right? But it is to say that our religion is more liberal, or maybe not liberal enough, because we are Christians and we allow for gay rights. We allow women to be free, but it's a form of secularism. It's a Christianity that is not about going to church every Sunday. It's a form of secular religion that becomes then cultural, and profoundly secularized, but it allows you to say, we are Christians because we are not Muslims. So it's exclusionary, and it crosses into the race issue as well, right? But it is maybe that would be what you call a sort of weaponization of religion. But it plays in that way too, powerfully in part of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, the Netherlands.
And this is clearly not only a northern phenomenon, right? I mean, India under Modi provides one of the most interesting illustrations of it, right? And, you know, Narendra Modi and Donald Trump famously get on famously, yeah, right? This is, and one of the reasons that they do is precisely, we would argue, this kind of idea of civilizational differentialism, this idea of a grounded civilization. And so the one thing I would, just to pick up on one thing you said, is not so much that they are against telling people how to live, right? They're against a particular liberal elite way of doing that. So what they're arguing for is a more literally grounded understanding of lives that are civilizationally and oftentimes theologically connected together, that gives people a certain commonality in their values, certain commonality in their forms of life, that mean that they less need to be told and rather they need to be reinforced in what they already believe. And that gives you a very, very different understanding. So this, this can be quite an authoritarian vision of the world, but it is not a liberal authoritarianism in their view. It's a legitimate authoritarian, morally.
This is not the only ideology that criticizes liberalism.
No.
There will be a lot of ideologies that criticize liberalism.
Yep.
And I think a radical conservative would ask sort of, liberalism has sort of run the globe the last, in the post-war period. And they would say a lot of the problems that we're dealing with today are because of liberalism. How would someone, how would yourself defend liberalism? Well, not just its ideology, but Marxism.
Thanks very much. My short answer to that question, it is $1 million question. And it is one that I don't think that liberals have addressed particularly well, or indeed effectively at all, in confronting what I think is the most foundational, fundamental challenge that liberalism has faced, not simply in the last 25 years, but in probably the last 75 years. And so to slightly sidestep your question a little bit, one of the reasons I think that this challenge is so fundamental is precisely because of this parallel erosion on the right. So if we take a look at the liberal international order, the liberal world order from post-1945, we make a mistake, I think, if we view it simply as a liberal world order. It was a liberal world order that was also built, indeed, maybe even primarily built by liberal conservatives or by conservative liberals, certainly from the late 1940s through the early 1970s. And what we're seeing now is basically the kicking away of that leg of the liberal stool. And as a consequence, liberalism is radically weakened. So for me, one of the most important things here is the transformation within conservatism that has left liberalism more prey, both electorally, but also ideologically, to exactly the kinds of critiques that it was insulating itself from before. I think liberalism is going to have to take some of these issues seriously. I really don't think that it is enough to simply say, as many liberals do, what, you believe we can run a world without experts, right? Which is the standard one to come back. Now, it may well be true that trying to run a world without experts, and we will see in terms of Kennedy and the American Health Administration, see how this goes, right? That running a world without experts may turn out to be a rather tricky and destructive thing, which will generate a backlash. But on the other hand, many parts of the right are not hostile to expertise. They're hostile to particular forms of it, right? And I think liberals are going to have to get their head around the idea that there are substantive issues here that often involve asking very uncomfortable questions about oneself, right? So one of the reasons that I first got interested, we first got interested in this book, is that if there is one class of people that is really, really has a hard time accepting some of these positions, it tends actually to be academics, right? Because it undermines or attacks almost everything that people believe about themselves. And overturning that, I think, at the very least, and getting people to question hard some of those assumptions rather than just reject them, is a first step, at least, to regenerating a liberal politics that might be vaguely competitive to this stuff. But if you have any answers to that question, send me a note.
Hi, thanks, Chris. Thanks so much, guys. My question kind of leads almost directly from what you just said. Like, is much of this our fault? Not us as the fault of liberals, and specifically in the context of university the rise of alternative academic institutions or centers of learning and advocacy, are we culpable and complicit in some way by actually acting in ways that validate some of the criticisms against us? I mean, those of us who've sat on appointment panels over the past 20 years, hand on heart, how many of us can say that, you know, no appointment panels we've ever been on influenced by discomfort over someone from the right perspective, and that actually worked against them. I've seen it again and again. I'm possibly guilty of it myself, I'm not sure. But to what extent have we helped create this problem? And in that case, do we have a role in alleviating or ameliorating?
Give me one thing to say quick, and then I'll let Rita give the better answer to this question. It's a question that was actually asked by the liberal conservative New York Times columnist David Brooks a couple of years ago. He wrote a column called "What If We're to Blame?" Right? And it made a lot of people very, very uncomfortable, because the easy response to that is, "Oh, you're blaming the victims," right? That we're the good guys, and we're the ones who are being attacked by these nasty people. There is a degree of truth to that. There is absolutely no doubt that there's a degree of truth to that. But there is also a degree that the effectiveness of those attacks is something that should cause us to question very, very strongly, I think, the degree to which we are to blame. And the we is not just universities, but much more broadly. But Rita, please give a better answer than
No, I don't have a better answer, but I agree with Michael. I think we do all have to take a hard look in the mirror, because, you know, if you're part of the expert class, you make sure that your children and your grandchildren, everyone, are going to be the one who benefit. That you know, as a class, we've reproduced ourselves as a class of well-educated elites. We make sure that whatever happens in the world, we're going to be just as well off, right? And others are going to be the losers. And with many of the policies that have been enacted in the universities, that has reinforced that. And one of the soul-searching issues that are going on in American elite universities right now centers on that, and it should center on that. So I think we are not, or the experts in the liberal elite are not necessarily to blame, but if we carry on as if we had nothing to do with it, I think the situation is going to get increasingly more confrontational, and it's certainly not going to be solved. I could say more about academics, but I'll hold it.
Thanks for the excellent speech. So I try to make my question much more simplified. I'm not that good at English expression, so my question might be a little bit practical, but a little bit attractive. So, Professor Abrahamsen mentioned that in Europe, let's say the far right wing and the new right-wing populism is using the application as zero thoughts of propaganda. So it's really reminding and experiment that I'll take a small instance in France. Like the traditional media is not just the helper of the rising of the far right wing. They are themselves are part of the far right wing, just like the Figaro is actually controlled by the Dassault company. It's not about the relationship between the Dassault company and the French government, especially the French army. And it's a quite common phenomenon in the most of in the developed world that the traditional media, especially newspapers and websites, is controlled by a small circle of the large oligarchy. Even in Asia, like say the South Korea, the Chilean people, the South Korean newspaper is actually a family business. It's not even a morning company. It's controlled by the 3 members of the single family. So do you think that this kind of phenomenon will become much more stronger in the future to become a catalyst or even a crucial motivation about the rise of the far right? Because it is known well that the traditional, we call them mainstream media, choosing their own viewpoint and became much more radical, it's become much more common. So do you think this kind of phenomenon become much more stronger and spread onwards? especially in Europe.
Excellent, thank you. I think one of the things that we have observed over the years, we've been working on this, and as Michael said, I think we started around 2015 on this project. One of the things we've observed is how much the radical right in its various ways and forms have succeeded in mainstreaming their ideas. So, you know, there used to be a time where you would never see Alain de Benoit quoted even in the French papers. He was like a bête noire and he wouldn't be there, right? All of a sudden he comes out again and can comment on current affairs, right? So there has been very much a mainstreaming of these ideas into the mainstream acceptable press. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. I don't know about the ownership so much, how that plays out around Europe in terms of the structures, but I think definitely we see just, and this has been the target, right? This has been the aim, to get these ideas to be acceptable, to be the ways in which around elections issues get framed in ways that draws on what the radical right has said as critiques. And I think that is one of the ways in which the transmission belt works. Somebody said earlier, you know, what about those people who don't read these texts and these books? How do they come to think like that? They circulate in this way by making their way through normalization into the respectable mainstream media. I hope that goes some way towards answering your question.
They also, of course, I mean, the question of elite money here and massive amounts of elite money is very, very important, right? I mean, one can't understand many of these phenomena without understanding quite literally the kinds of resources that have been mobilized behind them. The Koch brothers were the pioneers in this in the United States, but it's manifested itself in many different ways and places now. Peter Thiel, for example, is an operator in some of these networks, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing that one finds really interestingly is how the non-mainstream media, here we do come back to digital media, has been really, really important, right? And the way in which the radical right has often in very, very low-tech kind of ways been able to generate various kinds of podcasts and online shows that have become remarkably powerful and influential across a wide variety of statements, right? So there's an interesting question for anyone who's interested in this. And if you want to spend a couple of 100 hours having a look at some of the podcasts, what are the performative politics on the right that make this stuff so engaging for people, right? There's a really, really interesting, we tried to do a little bit of this involving dystopian politics, the way it evokes certain kinds of dystopias. But there's also an interesting way of putting humor and news together in ways that have been very, very influential. There's various kinds of interactive, almost sometimes 3, 4, 5-hour podcasts that people can listen to in the background. You don't really listen to it. It's just kind of there, but it pops in and out. And one of the interesting phenomena is that in terms of listenerships, these kinds of outlets have been massively more popular than anything from their ideological competitors. And that I think is really, really fascinating, right? Why is that? And then I think there's room for enormous study of that, none of which we have done on stress.
Very much, very enlightened. I'm looking for something to be optimistic about. So you mentioned towards the end you talked about academics and elites again. At the start, you said that the left behind weren't demographically significant. You know, to explain the radical right. I wonder if it can't be bothered to be demographically significant. You know, so not elite, but just maybe and not left behind, but not really doing terribly much because we're too busy or can't be bothered. And so I wonder if in your research, you found anything to be optimistic about in terms of, either grassroots movements, communities and community activists who are not elites, but who are, not, just ready to be kind of taken over by a youth in the form of the radical right. So I'm really hoping there's something to be optimistic about in there.
Oh, you come to the wrong place for optimism.
We don't sell a lot of optimism.
We were in a workshop in Edinburgh a couple of days ago, and we're between hope and despair. And at the end, we were all despairing more than. And I think, speaking for both of us, that we've become less optimistic at the end of this project than we were at the beginning. So where do we look for hope, or what is to be done? Right? We don't have many answers to that question. I think one answer is that by trying to understand better, academically understand where they come from, is a first step towards beginning to think about solutions or where to find hope. Because if we are to dismiss them without taking them seriously, by them I mean the thinkers and the politicians and the activists behind the radical right, if we dismiss them without understanding them, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. So in that sense, we could see a search for understanding and analysis as a first step towards finding the hope. I also think we have to think very hard about how we live our lives, right? We live in such bubbles, right? Do we ever meet anyone that is not exactly more or less like us, right? And if we don't, then how do we find common ways of understanding? And I think that's a challenge in how modernity or modern societies are structured, right? We live in our bubbles. We live within an elite. I hardly know anyone who's not more or less like me, right? And I think there's something to think about there that is important. But I don't know if that's very hopeful, but that's the best I can do.
I'll give you a quasi hopeful, if I can,
Oh,
right?
that's the first.
So I am a citizen of what Mr. Trump likes to call the 51st state. In other words, I'm a Canadian. And if you take a look at the latest Canadian election, you see, in fact, a radical transformation in the political fortunes of the Liberal Party of Canada. Largely, almost in fact, exclusively, first of all, from getting rid of Justin Trudeau, who had passed his sell-by date, but secondly, in an explicit reaction against Trumpian politics. It appears that you see the same kind of thing happening in Australia. On the one hand, that's quite a positive thing if you're not a member of the radical right. On the other hand, very interestingly, it has often come attached to a very strong nationalism. So we get into the whole question of the progressive or regressive elements of nationalism vis-a-vis liberalism, which I think are very, very interesting questions to try to take on board. It's also important to note that this reaction vis-a-vis Trump is by no means universal. In Germany, for example, it doesn't seem to be playing out quite the same way in terms of opinion polls. The AfD seems to still be doing quite well. In France, it's trickier to know. If the Trump administration utterly blows things up in practical terms, that might in fact provide some space. I think our biggest admonition would be it will only provide space rather than a simple swing back to the normal. Ever since we started doing this work, so the last thing I'll say, ever since we started doing this work, we've read over and over again. The Financial Times used to do it all the time. They finally stopped doing it. The Economist still does it on occasion, for those of you who read that publication, that don't worry, it'll swing back the other way, right? They'll get so much support, but they have a natural ceiling. Oh, it turns out their natural ceiling is a lot higher than we thought. Don't worry, the other parties will form a cordon sanitaire around them. Oh, it turns out that cordon is actually not really very strong at all. It's getting breached all over the place, right? So the idea that somehow the adults in the room will reassert themselves in some kind of natural swing back to normal, I think is simply a centrist fantasy that we have got to get rid of. And if we see an opportunity here in terms of some kind of blowback against the politics of these people in power, it is one that one has to grasp in a practical sense and engage a lot of the things that people have been talking about tonight to figure out precisely how one is going to respond to it effectively, rather than just believing, fine, it had its day, it blew it, and now we can all go back to being ourselves. I don't think we can. A great question, thank
Well, that's what passes for a high vote.
you. That's as good as it gets.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. There were quite a few more questions in the audience, which unfortunately we just don't have time to get to. But can we thank Professors Rita Abrahamsen and Michael Williams for a really fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.